we've been speaking about the ultimate objective of our existence. What's the objective? What do we have to achieve? In life, we see many things, whether it's nature, whether it's people's behavior, or how nature impacts on our lives. And the question is how we process this. What are the takeaways? If a person has no level of understanding of anything other than his physical needs, when you put a seed in the ground and it grows, the peasant farmer, what does he understand? You put it in the ground, you water it, you fertilize it, it grows. And of course, you need rain, and you need sun, and you can't have blight. But other than that, what does he understand? Does he understand the level of genius, what is needed to bring about that process? Photosynthesis, the rain, the sun, the seed germinating, the ground, the soil, the nutrients, how all this interacts. And ultimately, something grows out of the ground, which is either nutritious, edible, or just not edible. Different types of species, endless species. Literally, the species border on the infinite in terms of vegetation. There's certain species they find in the Amazon jungle, which only these indigenous tribes are aware of, and they are able to heal every conceivable disease and illness without even aware they exist. There's so much in existence, which it's beyond our capacity even to comprehend, to fathom. But what does that all say? Whoever created this, he's unfathomable. Not only because we know he's infinite, because as I said at Sinai, it was understood by us when God revealed himself to the Jewish people. And as the commentators cite the Midrash, God opened heavens and earth and showed nobody exists outside of himself. Then we understood that he's one and only. We understood everything emanates from him. So the Ramchal explains, Rabbi Luzzatto, to be able to fathom his genius, his essence, is impossible. It's beyond any creation, even the greatest angel, because he's infinite. But what are we supposed to try to come to understand? And that has relevance to us achieving our own level of perfection, to be worthy of having a relationship with him. It's to recognize by the process of elimination, nobody is of his dimension of being. What that being is, we have no understanding. What his genius is, we have no understanding. What his capabilities, we have no understanding. His attributes only have relevance for us to get a glimpse, an inkling of who he is, because that's what he reveals to us. So from the way he interacts with existence, which is our humanity, we have takeaways. What are the takeaways? The takeaway has to be, and that's the objective of every Jew, and there are many levels of takeaway, that everything emanates from him. We could all say it, but to be able to internalize it, the more you study, the more you reflect, the more you advance, the more profound it becomes. And the more profound it becomes, you merit, even in your lifetime, to have a relationship with God. The Jewish people established a relationship with God at Sinai, because when he offered us his Torah, which is the basis for our relationship, the commandments, we're the only nation among all the nations of the world accepted it. We embraced it. Only through that do we have a sense of who he is. Because the only way you could have a sense of who he is you have to be spiritualized. Through our own spiritualization, which only can come through the commandments, the positive commandments, and not violating the negative commandments, does that allow us, although we're physical beings, to activate and advance our spirituality, which is based on our spiritual core, which is the neshama of the Jew. So what is the objective? Not to understand who he is. That's impossible. But to understand there's no one like him. Nothing exists outside of him. So that we're able to understand. I've mentioned the first human being who came upon God's being, the monotheistic being, the omnipotent being, was Avram Avinu. And how did he come upon God? Adam knew God was the creator because he was God's creation. He was created, put into the Garden of Eden. There was no evils. Everything was absolutely clear to him. Therefore, he understood God is the creator, he's the maker, he's the one who wills, and everything is God. But Avram Avinu, Abraham, the founding patriarch of Jewish people, he was born into a pagan world. There wasn't a trace of God's existence, other than the son of Shem, who was a handful of people believed in God. The world believed everything is deities. The powers lie with the angels. And that's who you worship. So how did he come upon it? He reflected on the world and he said, I see such a magnificent creation, which is comprised of literally components and parts which border on the infinite. And they complement one another. That means there's one maker who created all of them. There are no forces which are vying for control, but rather they all work in sync and they function in sync. And there's a symmetry. Tells me there's one maker. Who is that maker? And the Midrash, and I mentioned this many times in the past, explains it with an allegory. A person sees a citadel with endless rooms. Each room is illuminated. And it's a functional citadel. And it's something magnificent. And the person calls out, Mi balabira, who's the master of the citadel? And he keeps calling out. There's no answer. Why is there no answer? Because it's unfathomable to understand who that is. Until God himself says to Avram, I am the master of the citadel. So we speak about Avram coming upon God. It's not Avram figured it out. You can't figure it out. Because a man is finite. As much as we believe we have the answer, but who said we see the whole picture? To make the evaluation that this must be the answer. Maybe there are endless other answers. But what Avram understood, that there's nothing comparable to this. Therefore, he wanted to know who is the master. God said, I am the master. And he accepted it. But did he understand who God is? But one thing he understood, that God is the creator of this citadel, of this existence. Did he understand how? Did he understand God's genius, God's ability, who God was? No. God says, I am the master. So Avram only was able to grasp up to the point that God revealed him. Beyond that, it's impossible because you cannot fathom the infinite. As Avram couldn't fathom the infinite, the greatest angel cannot fathom the infinite. Because the finite, as I say, cannot fathom beyond its own capacity. So what is the objective of the Jew? What is the objective of our life? To understand Echad. That's the unity of God. Nothing exists outside of him. But what is he? We only know what he is only based on what he tells us, what he revealed to us. He's merciful. He's indiscriminately kind. He's exact. The 13 attributes of mercy. We only know that because God revealed it to Moshe. The 13 attributes of mercy. But even though we know the words, and we can all mouth the words, and we know what they represent, but to have an understanding of those words, the more a person advances spiritually, and the more spiritualized he becomes, there are endless levels of depth and breadth of understanding we could come upon. But the ultimate of who he is an impossibility. Because again, so how does one achieve perfection? It's to use the tools and the information which he shares with us, and with all that information, there's enough contained there to understand everything emanates from him. And that's within our capacity, as I said. But the process of elimination, by understanding what's not, we understand he is. What is he? He's the master. What does that mean? We have no idea, but we understand what master means. We know that he's not lacking in anything. He's the absolute. That's the objective. You know, there's the famous question which is asked by Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, Hashem Yinokim Domo. He was murdered by the Nazis in 1942 in Kovno. So he has a work, it's called Kovitz Mamorim. It's a compilation of various essays he wrote on Jewish belief, Jewish perspective. And he asks a question there. Rambam writes about Aristotle that he was able, through his genius, to come upon levels of understanding that a prophet can only come upon that only because God revealed those concepts to him. That was his level of genius. And yet, Aristotle did not believe in God. If Aristotle did not believe in God, how does God expect a 12-year-old girl, a 13-year-old boy, when he becomes bar mitzvah, becomes of age, of maturity, of adulthood, he has the obligation to believe in the unity of God, that there's only one power, which we're all this about. If Aristotle, the genius beyond genius, we can't fathom his genius. If he didn't believe, how do you expect it of this little limited child or ourselves? We don't have to talk about the child. How does God then expect that of us? That's his question. So he explains it with an allegory. And I once asked this question to our famous friend who's an atheist. I said to him, you see a skyscraper, magnificent skyscraper, and it's 100 stories in height. Its beauty, its structure, it's the materials. From the outside is one of a kind. You've never seen anything like it. You go inside and you see the advanced technology, which causes this everything to function within it. And the rooms, the way they're furnished, and the functionality of this building. It's not to be believed. And each room you walk in, there's a computer system that can process literally millions of pieces of information every day. And you say to this person, you know how this building came about? See this little matchbox? You take, somebody struck the match on it, there was an explosion, and after all the dust settled and the smoke went away, you had a 100-story skyscraper made of all these materials, exact, with a foundation which is a third as deep as the height of the building to be able to hold the building up, furnished with advanced technology not to be believed. That's how it happened. You know what it's called? It's called the Big Bang. That's what it's called. I said, would you believe me? Would you believe me? That's how it all came about. Do I need empirical evidence? Or you have to be a fool to think it came about through a Big Bang? That I pulled a string, there was an explosion, that's how it came about. You tell me Is that not the equivalent, my question, of the Big Bang? Well, you realize, but this took billions of years. But even it took billions of years. After it evolves and becomes everything, the symmetry, how everything complements one or the other, with such a level of precision and perfection, how's it possible? If certain chemicals in the body are off slightly, first it's called a chemical imbalance. A woman can't conceive. The heart doesn't function. The brain doesn't function. The person himself is bipolar. It has to be a certain way, exact measure. The balance has to be right. This evolved the way it happened. Well, these things happen. But people, they embrace it. Why? Because the so-called people who are greater geniuses believed in that. So who am I to question it? Firstly, the difference between us and them, we begin from fact. Our understanding of God is not, it's our analysis, and therefore our analysis and experienced life is only confirms what we believe. Our belief is rooted and based on fact. Because this atheist once asked me, Rabbi, if I would ask you a question that you can't answer, would you come onto my side and accept my position that there's no God? I said, no. Because I said my belief in God is not based on my takeaway of what I understand what creation is. It's based on what we call tradition. So many millions of Jews, going back so many years, thousands of years ago, openly witnessed God speaking to them. Every one of those Jews. That was fact. That was irrefutable fact. Beyond anything. That was truth on the absolute level. Because every Jew prophesied in a wake state. He passed it on to his child. You have a question. Just because you have a question, you don't have an answer, but that doesn't refute the basis of the fact. We have irrefutable evidence. Evidence is called fact, and that's called Masorah. That's called our tradition. What I see and what I live and what I understand and what I observe, that only reinforces the tradition. That's all it is. Whatever we believe, it's based on that nobody exists outside of God. That's called Echad. So when we say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, we're not saying we're smarter than Aristotle. We're not saying we're smarter than Aristotle. But we had that face-to-face experience. That was passed down. That's how we know. But let's get back to the question. The child. What does he see? So he explains it with an allegory. You have a person, he's the expert of experts. And he's the curator of a museum which has the art of all the masters. And he's lived it and breathed it all his life. And then you tell him, you try to sell him a bill of goods, that there's a canvas which has a painting on it. And it came about because the artist was about to paint the painting and he left the window open and left vials of paint. And the wind blew in. And when he came in the morning, all the vials were just spilled all over the canvas. And that's how this master came about. So the curator says, I'm the expert. I'm able to see the strokes, the color scheme, how it was developed. This goes beyond Rembrandt. And it said on the bottom, Rembrandt. His signature was on the bottom. Well, that also came about by itself. That was due to the wind coming through the window. He says, what do you think? I'm a fool. When you look at the world with an objective eye, not with any conflict of interest, you say this could only happen because there's one creator that created all this. As I said, based on the symmetry, based on how everything complements one another, based on the balance, whether it's the human body, whether it's nature, whatever it is, whether it's the ecology of the world. That's what it is. Couldn't happen any other way. So let's get back to Aristotle. The Torah says a fact. What is evidence in court? Testimony. You have two witnesses, they testify. What about if those witnesses have a conflict of interest? Are they qualified to testify? not qualified to testify. Why? Because we say a person has conflict of interest, he sees through colored lenses and it throws it off. It doesn't allow him to see accurately the truth. That's why a conflict of interest disqualifies the witness. What about a person, his life, what's primary in his life is to satisfy his desires, and he has overwhelming desires as he matures, whether it's for women, whether it's for ego, whether it's for food, whatever it is. So an ordinary person who doesn't have a superior intelligence, you could counter his position why he could justify that lifestyle. But Aristotle, you couldn't counter his genius. He was able to justify, as Aristotle, nobody could, because he's Aristotle, that there's no God. I understand that you're telling me you have a tradition. I don't have the tradition. But look at the world. He says, I'll give you my take on the world. And the most ingenious way, which, because we don't have his capacity, we can't poke holes in his approach, because he's Aristotle. But what does he see it? He's, because of his conflict, because of his desires, or whatever they may be, are so overwhelming, he will justify it in the most ingenious way, which we cannot see the forest from the trees. That's Aristotle. But the 12-year-old child or the 13-year-old boy who does not have those conflicts of interest, he has no reason to try to see it differently. So if his father teaches him based on the tradition, the 5 Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, was given at Sinai by God, that Moshe was the redeemer from Israel. And he spent so many days in heaven being taught by God. He brought it to us in the 10 commandments. So he asked the child, how do you know this? You know what the answer is? My father taught me. That's how I know it. And how did your father know it? Because his father taught him. And that's bottom line. And if you start from there, although you could see it differently, you don't see it differently, because you have the fact. You have the hardcore fact, which is reality. And therefore, as much as you try to convince me differently, it doesn't change the fact. Give you an example. Person spends time with his father, and now he's 20 years old. And he spent every day of his life with his father. And he knows every aspect of his father's personality, on the way he looks, and all his behavior patterns. And somebody comes at 20 and says, by the way, that man you think is your father, he's not the same person who you think he is. He's not telling him it's not his father. The one who you think that this is not A, this is what you think this is A, this is B. So what are you talking about? From the day I was born, I've seen this man. You're not saying I don't have a father. You say this man who you think is, he's not. So I say, but he looks like him, and he is him. He's just a replica, but he's not him. You say, you know something? Until you prove me that the fact is wrong, but even that, what happened at Sinai cannot be disproved. Of course, prophecy on a wake level, the way we prophesized, that goes beyond reality. Rambam writes, and the Ramchal will write, prophecy, the level of clarity, because prophecy is directly to the soul. It's not, we don't use the human faculty called the brain. That's how exact it is and how penetrating it is. Therefore, it's irrefutable. And that's where we began. So how do we achieve perfection? Not by understanding God, but perfection is to secure that position, understand there's nobody at God's level. And the more we study, the more we're spiritualized, the more we see in life, and you see through that lens, it only strengthens that to the point that we internalize it more and more. And because that internalization, we do his will. We do the positive commandments. We don't cross the lines. We don't allow our conflicts, our desires, as much as you want to eat that non-kosher food, as much as you want to violate the Shabbos, as much as you don't want to study Torah, because the level of spiritualization is so intense, you have the appreciation for what has value, and you go and you abandon whatever is contrary to that, and you keep your distance from that. We say in the Oleno every day, Ein od milavado. Nobody exists outside of him. When you say that, what does that mean? It's not that you understand him. And this is what the Ramchal is saying, Ein od milavado. The objective is to understand there's no power like God, that he's echad. Everything emanates from him. Whatever the sun, the moon, any spiritual angel, whatever it is, nothing exists outside of him. Whatever exists is because he wills it to be. But how does he do it? We only know to the degree that he divulged that to us. Outside, we have no idea. The Gemara Chulin and Talmud Chulin tells of her story that there was this woman, she was a witch. A true witchcraft, like we see in Egypt, you're able to turn the world upside down. They were able to replicate many of the plagues through witchcraft. You're able to harm a person and literally put every barrier in his place, that the person is literally incapacitated through witchcraft. So there was a certain great rabbi of the Talmud, and he wanted to go into a boat. And there was this woman, she was a witch. And she wanted to go into the boat with him. He didn't want her in the boat with him. She goes and she casts a spell. And the spell doesn't affect him. And this woman, there was no person ever who she cast a spell that the spell did not restrain that person or incapacitate the person. And as much as she tries, it's totally ineffective. So she says to the rabbi, what's it all about? Why can't I affect you? Everybody else I affect, why can't I affect you? She said one word, few words. Ein od milavado. Nobody exists outside of God. And because Ein od milavado, if God doesn't want me to be affected, you can't affect me. God being the maker, God willing every moment of existence. If you believe that concept to your core, and you live your life that nobody exists outside of God, nothing outside of God could affect you, unless it's the will of God. But if you don't believe Ein od milavado, meaning you don't internalize that reality, and therefore a person goes and he wants to endear himself to a person because he wants a favor. But if God is the one who underwrites existence, you have to endear yourself to no one. You endear yourself to God, he will provide everything. Whatever anybody can provide, it's all because God provides. So what are you playing up to the other person, ingratiating yourself with him? That automatically clearly says, we may say many things, but you understand, proof's in the pudding, as they used to say, put your money where your mouth is. You say one thing, so why are you trying to ingratiate yourself to this person? What do you want this relationship? Why are you currying favor? The answer is because although you're saying it's all determined by, of course, God could prevent it from happening. No. If you have that faith in God and trust in God, God could be the provider. You don't have to curry favor with this person. And that's what he said. The reason why you can't affect me, because I live my life, that every aspect of my life, it's God is the one who determines that. Everything emanates from God, including your power. If that's the case, you can't affect me. Because God, if I believe God, I can only affect it if God wants me to affect it. And therefore, God doesn't want, therefore you can't affect me. Famous word from Chaim Volozhin and Nefesh HaChaim. He writes that if a person truly believes Ein od milavado, this concept we're speaking about now, that no person, no power, no angel could affect you negatively. It's only if God wants you to be affected, you cannot be affected negatively by any power. And if you will be affected negatively, it's only because God wants at this moment you should be compromised. But it's not because that person wants to compromise you. And there's a famous story on the train when the Brisker Rav and a few of his children were on the train fleeing from Warsaw during the war. and he looked like a rabbi, and he was on the train, and he had papers to be able to escape from Poland. And he says to his son, just keep thinking continuously. Ain't old milavado. Your level has to be, nothing can happen to us if God doesn't want it to happen. And here you have Nazis checking papers, walking back and forth in the train with uniforms, Nazi uniforms. And there's already the Holocaust started. And the Brisker Reb's, all of a sudden, a Nazi officer starts approaching him. And he says to his son, you have to focus on Ein Od Milvado. And you have to internalize it to your core. And if you do, he can't harm you. And the moment his son focused on that, this person just passed them by. Looked like they were approaching, passed them by. But that's the understanding. So what is it? It's not we understand who God is, Ramchal says. You can't understand who God is. As I said, he's compassionate, he's merciful, he's exacting, judgment. That's not who he is. That's who he interacts with existence. Because existence can't exist unless he assumes these attributes to be able to, for us to function based on our limitation, because we're not at that special level. And the only way we could achieve that special level is only if he assumes these attributes to interact and relate to us and to give us that ability to fathom him based on our limitation. That's Ramchal.